90% of everyone in America named Washington is black. Not half, not most. 9 out of every 10 people carrying that name are direct descendants of enslaved Africans. And Washington is not alone. Jefferson, Jackson, Freeman, Brown, Williams, these names are sitting on birth certificates, school records, and headstones across this country. And most of the people who carry them have spent their entire lives believing the trail behind that name simply goes cold at the edge of an ocean, that the history was destroyed, that the records were burned, that the people who were taken were meant to be forgotten permanently and completely. But something happened. A combination of ancient DNA technology, the largest genetic databases ever built, and a series of landmark scientific studies, including one published in the journal Science by researchers from Harvard University, the Smithsonian Institution, and 23andMe, has done something that no courthouse document, no plantation ledger, and no shipping record was ever able to do on its own. It walked backward through 400 years of deliberate erasure, crossed an ocean, and found the people waiting on the other side. These are 15 surnames that slavery stamped onto your family. And this is what the DNA finally revealed when researchers went looking for where those families actually came from. But before we count them, you need to understand something about the name you carry. Because misunderstanding what a surname means in this context, and what it cannot tell you, is the difference between searching in the wrong place for the rest of your life and finally finding the right door. You make it exponentially harder for their descendants to ever find their way back. When emancipation finally arrived after the Civil War, nearly 4 million people needed a surname overnight. You needed one to sign a work contract. You needed one to register yourself as a citizen. You needed one to place an advertisement in a newspaper searching for a child who had been sold away from you years earlier. So people chose. Some took the name of the man who had most recently claimed to own them, not out of loyalty, but because that name was the only paper trail that might lead a scattered family back to each other. Some took the names of founding fathers as a quiet act of defiance, claiming a piece of the country that had promised them everything and delivered almost nothing. Some invented names entirely. Some chose a single word that meant something: freedom, hope, a new beginning. What almost none of them could do was recover the African name that had been theirs from birth. That name was gone. So understand this clearly before we go any further. The surname you carry is not a map to Africa. It is a fingerprint of slavery. It points to a plantation, a county, an enslaver, not to your homeland. For 150 years, that was where every trail ended, right at the edge of the water. But here is what changed everything. When you take that surname fingerprint and you combine it with your DNA, the two working together can carry you across the ocean to the precise people and places the system spent 4 centuries trying to erase from your memory. Before we name the surnames, you need to know about the wall. Genealogists have a specific term for the barrier that almost every black family in America eventually runs straight into during family research. They call it the 1870 brick wall. The census conducted in 1870 was the very first one in American history to list formerly enslaved people as full human beings, recorded by name, counted as individuals, rather than as property grouped under someone else's household. Go back just one more census to 1860, and your ancestors simply disappear from the record. No name, just an age, a gender, and a checkmark on a slave schedule filed underneath a white landowner's property count. For millions of families, that wall, that single year, is where the paper trail ends completely, and for a century and a half, that was simply the limit. There was no door left to open. This is the precise wall that DNA technology finally climbs over. Number 15, Carter. It sounds like a straightforward English name, and it is an occupational name for the man who drove a cart. But in the American South, it became something far more significant. Carter plantations spread across Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia on some of the largest tobacco estates in the colonial period. The enslaved people held on that land carried the name into freedom by the thousands. Tobacco was year-round labor, and the estates that grew it were among the oldest in the country, which means the paper records reach further back than almost any other region. If your people are Carters rooted in the Chesapeake area, your documentary trail runs unusually deep through Virginia soil. And when Carter descendants have tested their DNA, the results consistently point toward West Central Africa, the region the old records called Congo and Angola. This is not coincidence. That region was the single largest source of enslaved people brought to the Americas across the entire 400 years of the transatlantic trade. It surfaces again and again in the blood of families who never knew that connection was alive inside them. Number 14, Robinson. A name meaning son of Robin, brought across from England and Scotland long before it ever touched this continent. It became one of the most widespread surnames among black families across the Mississippi Delta and the Cotton Belt, where entire communities of Robinsons worked the same land across multiple generations. When Robinson descendants test today, the results frequently point toward the Bight of Biafra, the stretch of coastline wrapping around what is now southeastern Nigeria. That region sent enormous numbers of Igbo and Efik people into bondage, so many that their cultural fingerprints, their food traditions, their speech patterns, and their spiritual practices still echo through black communities across the American South today, carried by people who have no idea where those traditions actually originated. The name says England. The blood says Nigeria. Both are true at the exact same time. And that contradiction, held inside a single family across generations, is the compressed story of everything that was done and everything that survived. Number 13, Mosley, sometimes spelled Mosley, an Old English name drawn from a place, a field, a piece of land someone once worked. Among black Americans, it clusters tightly in Alabama, Georgia, and the Carolinas. What makes Mosley particularly significant for researchers is how firmly these families tended to stay put after emancipation, taking deep roots in the same counties for generation after generation, rather than scattering widely. For anyone trying to reconstruct a family line, that geographic stability is an extraordinary gift. The local church books, county records, land deeds, and freedmen's bureau filings tend to survive together in the same location. And when Mosley descendants submit DNA tests, the results frequently illuminate the Gold Coast region, modern-day Ghana, home of the Akan people. The Akan were master goldsmiths, architects, and traders whose kingdoms were among the wealthiest and most sophisticated in all of West Africa before the trade devastated them. Number 12, Harris. This name is everywhere. One of the most common surnames in the entire country, and among black Americans, it runs particularly deep through coastal Carolina and Virginia. Harris derives from Harry, a medieval English given name. But the way black Harris families concentrate along the coastline tells its own separate story. That stretch of coastal Carolina and Georgia is Gullah Geechee country, a culture that preserved more of its African roots than almost any other community in North America, precisely because the geographic isolation of the Sea Islands allowed those roots to survive. The DNA of families deeply embedded in that coastal region points again and again toward the Windward Coast and Sierra Leone's rice country. Enslaved people from those regions were specifically sought and taken because they already possessed generations of knowledge about growing rice in flooded fields. That stolen expertise built the enormous fortunes of the low country planting class. If your name is Harris and your people root back to coastal Carolina, your ancestors may have been the precise reason an entire regional economy was able to function at all. Number 11, Coleman. A name meaning charcoal maker, or in some traditions, a follower of an Irish saint, depending on which etymology you follow. Coleman families spread through Tennessee, Kentucky, and across the Deep South. What makes Coleman stand out in the historical record is how frequently the name appears in freedmen's bureau files, the paperwork generated in the 1860s at the exact moment slavery ended. Those documents are extraordinary because they record the newly freed in their own words, by their own names, at the precise instant of emancipation. That paper is irreplaceable for a researcher trying to push through the 1870 brick wall. When Coleman descendants test their DNA, all the results commonly illuminate the Senegambia region, the area around the Senegal River and the Gambia, homeland of the Mandinka, the Wolof, and the Fula peoples. The landmark Harvard and Smithsonian study published in Science, which analyzed ancient DNA recovered from 27 enslaved individuals buried at Catoctin Furnace in Maryland, confirmed the Wolof and Mandinka as one of the primary African source populations for enslaved people brought into the early United States. If Senegambia lights up in your results, you may be looking at one of the very first populations drawn into the transatlantic trade. Number 10, Gaines. A sharper, less common name, and that rarity is a genealogist's best friend. Gaines traces back to a Norman French origin and, in America, attached itself to specific slaveholding families in Virginia and Kentucky, whose records happen to be better preserved than most. Here is why that matters practically. When a surname is rare, there are fewer families to confuse, fewer identical names clogging the same census pages, and cleaner documents to follow from one generation to the next. A Gaines descendant can sometimes push a documented family line further back than almost anyone else on this entire list. The DNA of Gaines descendants frequently points towards southwestern Nigeria and the Yoruba, and one of the largest, most studied, and most richly documented ethnic groups in all of West Africa, with an unbroken history of kingdoms, cities, universities, and art that stretches back over 1,000 years. A rare name, preserved records, and a clear DNA signal pointing to one of Africa's most distinguished civilizations. If your family name is Gaines, you may be closer to a real answer than you have ever let yourself believe. Number 9, Booker. That name should ring a familiar bell. Booker T. Washington, born into slavery and risen to become one of the most consequential figures in American history, carried it. Booker comes from an Old English word for someone who copied manuscripts by hand, a scribe, which is a quietly layered irony for a name now inseparably connected to a man who made black literacy the central fight of his life. Among black families, Booker runs through Virginia and the surrounding states. It is not a common surname, and that scarcity, again, works directly in your favor when you start searching. Booker descendants frequently find deep West Central African ancestry in their results, pointing back to the Congo and Angola region, connecting them to that largest single-source population of enslaved arrivals to the Americas. A rare name, sitting on top of a traceable African origin, that is precisely the kind of combination that turns a dead end that has frustrated a family for generations into a wide-open doorway. Number 8, Banks, a name that simply describes someone who lived near the bank of a river. Among Black Americans, Banks families concentrate heavily across Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. What makes Banks genuinely fascinating as a research subject is that when genealogists map the name across time, it actually traces the migration routes Black families walked and traveled out of the rural South during the Great Migration, the massive movement of Black Americans northward into Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and Cleveland between roughly 1910 and 1970. The surname becomes a trail of breadcrumbs stretching across a century of American movement. Banks descendants who test frequently see the Bight of Benin illuminate in their results. The coastal region around modern Benin and Togo, homeland of the Fon and Yu peoples, and the birthplace of spiritual traditions that crossed the Atlantic and survived in transformed form across the Americas. Number 7, Freeman. This one is different from every other name on this list. Freeman was not the name of an enslaver. It was not the name of a plantation. It was a declaration of identity. When emancipation came, thousands of formerly enslaved people refused to carry any name tied to bondage and chose Freeman instead, a word that announced everything about who they had decided to become, now that the choice was finally theirs. If your family name is Freeman, there's a meaningful and beautiful possibility that your ancestors made that specific choice deliberately, an act of quiet defiance written permanently into a name and sent forward through time to everyone who came after them. Because the name was freely chosen rather than inherited from a specific plantation, Freeman descendants appear across the map, and their DNA spreads across every major region of West and Central Africa, from Senegambia to Angola. The name tells you almost nothing about which plantation your ancestors escaped, but it tells you everything about the kind of people they were the moment they were finally free to decide. Number 6, Brown. One of the most common surnames in the entire English language and among Black Americans, it is simply enormous, spread across every southern state and far beyond. For a long time, that very commonness made the name feel impossible to trace productively. Too many Browns scattered too widely with documentation, too sparse to separate one family from the next. But this is precisely where DNA cuts through noise that paper records cannot. Brown descendants who test find their results pointing across multiple regions, though a substantial share land in that West Central African heartland alongside the Carters and the Bookers. If you have ever looked at your last name and felt it was too ordinary, too ubiquitous to lead anywhere specific, understand this. The name is the haystack. The DNA is the instrument that finds the needle hidden inside it. Number 5, Johnson. Son of John, one of the most widespread surnames in all of America across every background and community. But among Black families, it stands as one of the most common names in the country, running thick through the Deep South, and then moving northward into the industrial cities during the Great Migration into Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland. Johnson descendants, who test commonly find strong connections to the Bight of Biafra and the Igbo of southeastern Nigeria. The 23andMe study that combined DNA from more than 50,000 people on both sides of the Atlantic with the actual shipping records of the transatlantic trade found more Nigerian ancestry and African American results than the shipping manifests alone could account for, evidence that internal slave trading between British Caribbean colonies and the American South moved enormous numbers of people whose journeys no single document ever fully captured. So many Black Johnson descendants carry that same Nigerian signal that it stops feeling like scattered coincidence and starts feeling like a homecoming waiting to be claimed. Number 4, Williams. Now the numbers become staggering. Williams is one of the most common surnames in all of America. More than 750,000 Black Americans carry it. More than any other name on this entire list. Son of William, brought from Wales and England, then planted across the southern states in numbers almost too large to picture. That scale creates a genuine research challenge because there are enormous numbers of identical names crowding census records and making individual family lines harder to isolate through documents alone. But it also means Williams' descendants form one of the single largest testable genetic communities in the country, a vast web of cousins who, when they test, scatter across all 4 major African source regions at once. If you are a Williams, your family is not a footnote in this history. In its sheer documented scale, your family is the history itself. Number 3, Jackson. According to U.S. Census data, 53% of all Americans named Jackson are Black. More than half of everyone carrying a name stamped on cities, streets, stadiums, and state capitals across this country is a descendant of enslaved people. Jackson runs deep through Mississippi, Alabama, and the Carolinas. The DNA of Jackson descendants reaches broadly across West Africa, with particularly strong connections to the Gold Coast and the Bight of Benin, toward the Akan, the Fawn, and the Ewe. There is a heavy irony buried in the fact that a name shared with a slaveholding president would become, within a few generations, carried overwhelmingly by the descendants of the very people that system tried to permanently erase from history. But that irony contains its own kind of power. Your ancestors took the name that was forced onto them and, through sheer unbroken survival, made it undeniably their own. Number 2, Jefferson. This is the second most concentrated black surname in the country by percentage. 3 out of every 4 people carrying the name Jefferson in America are black, and you already know exactly where this name originates. Thomas Jefferson wrote the words that declared all men are created equal, while he enslaved more than 600 human beings across the course of his lifetime. Among them was a woman named Sally Hemings, and the research confirming Jefferson's paternity of her children, work supported by Y chromosome DNA analysis, became one of the landmark cases in the history of genetic genealogy. The descendants of the people Jefferson held in bondage carried his name out of Monticello and into the world. When Jefferson descendants test their DNA today, results reach toward West Central Africa and toward Nigerian regions in patterns that reflect the full sweep of the transatlantic trade. The name signed at the top of the Declaration of Independence is now carried 3 times out of 4 by the living descendants of the very people that document quietly forgot existed. Number 1, Washington, the blackest surname in America. 90% of all people carrying the name Washington are black, 9 out of every 10. No other common surname in the entire country comes anywhere near that figure. The name belongs to the first president of the United States, a man who inherited enslaved human beings before he was old enough to vote. And after the Civil War, freed black families claimed that name in numbers that still astonish researchers today. Some took it to make a claim on a country that had promised them everything and delivered almost nothing. Some took it as the single paper trail they could follow, the one thread that might lead scattered family members back to each other. In the state of Tennessee alone, records show that more than 200 people freed from a single plantation walked into their emancipation carrying the Washington name. And when their descendants test their DNA today, the results do what the ledgers and slave schedules never could. They point back across the Atlantic toward the regions that built the American South, with hands that were never paid and lives that were never returned. Here is the honest truth that matters more than any single name on this entire list. Your surname cannot tell you your clan. It never could. The name traces an enslaver, or traces the exact moment your ancestors first claimed themselves. It is a starting point, not a destination. What actually carries your people, your origin, your true clan across centuries is the DNA. And the science doing this work right now is extraordinary. The Harvard, Smithsonian, and 23andMe study published in Science Analyzed Ancient DNA recovered from 27 enslaved individuals buried at Catoctin Furnace in Maryland and used it to connect more than 41,000 living people to those individuals through shared genetic segments sitting in a database of over 9 million participants. The researchers identified specific African groups as sources: the Wolof and Mandinka of Senegambia and the Congo of Central Africa, while also finding that the broader African-American genetic record carries far more Nigerian, Igbo, and Yoruba ancestry than shipping records alone can explain, because people were bought, sold, and moved multiple times between colonies long after any single crossing was recorded. This is the science that is operating right now. People are sitting with results from a cheek swab in a plastic tube and finding living cousins in Nigeria, in Ghana, in Angola, and in Sierra Leone. Not vague regional estimates, actual relatives sharing measurable, countable segments of the exact same DNA, sitting in villages their shared ancestors left centuries ago. The family that slavery tore apart is being carefully and deliberately stitched back together, one test, one match, one name at a time. You might be wondering how a DNA test can actually reach across 4 centuries and an entire ocean to find a specific people. It comes down to something called autosomal DNA, the genetic code you inherit from every branch of your family tree simultaneously. Not just one narrow line. You share specific, measurable segments of it with every person you are related to. The closer the relationship, the larger and more numerous those shared segments are. When someone in Lagos or Accra or Freetown takes the same test and their results appear in the same database as yours, the system detects the exact segments the two of you hold in common and can calculate how you connect. That is how a person in Atlanta discovers a third cousin in Nigeria they never knew existed. It is not a guess or an approximation. It is a shared fragment of the same ancestor, still sitting in both of your bodies, patient and intact, waiting to be noticed. The hardest part of this search was never the science. The science now exists, and it is more powerful than anything your grandparents could have imagined. The hardest part has always been believing there is something real left to find. There is. The people who were taken were never truly erased because the proof of their existence and their origin is alive and measurable inside you right now. And for the first time in 400 years, the tools exist to follow that proof all the way home. If any name on this list belongs to your family, understand exactly what you're holding. It is not a mark of shame. It is not the end of a story. It is a thread. And that thread leads somewhere specific, somewhere real, somewhere waiting. Drop down into the comments right now and tell us which name your family carries and where in the world your DNA has pointed you. Your ancestors survived what should not have been survivable so that you could be sitting here asking this question. Now let us go and find the answer together.